Hey, welcome to The Explainer. This is where we take really big topics and, break them down into stories that actually make sense. So, how does that happen? How do you get from a king just wanting a son to another king losing his head and the birth of modern democracy? Well, let's dive into this absolutely incredible 150-year story of power, religion, and revolution. It didn't just transform England, it really laid the groundwork for the world we live in today.
All right, so our story kicks off with the Tudors. And really, it all comes down to one man, King Henry VIII. He had this all-consuming, desperate need for a son, a male heir, to make sure his dynasty would survive.
And I mean, just look at the human cost of that ambition. This quest for a son took him through 6 different wives. It's this whole saga that, for most of the women involved, had a really grim ending. And after all that turmoil, what did he get? Just one sickly male heir, Edward, from his third wife, James Seymour. And she died right after giving birth. Just incredible.
So, to get that first divorce, the one from Catherine of Aragon, Henry had to do something nobody thought was possible. He literally just broke away from the Catholic Church and the Pope's authority. And you have to understand, this wasn't just about solving his marriage problem. No way. This move kicked off the entire English Reformation, and suddenly, the king was the one in charge of religion in his own country.
And that right there is the crucial point. What starts as this deeply personal crisis for one guy, one king, ends up unleashing this massive chain reaction. By making himself the head of the Church of England, Henry completely rewrote the rules. He changed the relationship between the monarchy, the church, and the English people forever. And in doing so, he let loose forces that he and his successors could never fully control.
And yeah, that decision, it plunged England into just total religious instability. It was a real roller coaster. Henry's own beliefs were kind of complicated, but the door he kicked open, it led straight to decades of pure chaos once his kids took over.
So after Henry dies, his 3 children take the throne one by one, and each of them drags the country in a completely different direction. First, his son Edward goes hardline Protestant. Then, his daughter Mary, a super devout Catholic, tries to violently yank everything back the other way. I mean, she earned the nickname Bloody Mary for a reason. It was just a terrifying, divisive time to be alive.
And then finally, his third child, Elizabeth I, she steps in and manages to bring decades of stability, which the country desperately needed. She brings back a more moderate Protestant church, she famously beats the Spanish Armada in 1588, and she oversees this incredible cultural boom that we now call a golden age. You see, that stability, that's what allowed for this explosion in art and drama. And of course, nobody captured the spirit of that age better than William Shakespeare. A line like this from Hamlet, it just shows how his plays were digging into these huge, timeless questions about power and life and death in ways that honestly still hit home for us today. Okay, so when Elizabeth dies childless, that's it for the Tudor dynasty. The line ends. Her cousin, James VI of Scotland, comes down and becomes King James I of England. So now the crowns are united. This is the beginning of the Stuart dynasty. And boy, did they bring a new and, well, let's just say explosive idea with them. Yeah, James I and his son Charles I, they were all in on this idea of the divine right of kings. They truly believed that their power came straight from God, and because of that, they didn't have to answer to anyone on earth, especially not some, meddling group of politicians in Parliament.
But here's the problem. That idea? It was on a direct collision course with Parliament, which had been getting more and more powerful and confident for the last 100 years. The members of Parliament were like, no, we absolutely have the right to challenge you, Mr. King, especially when you're talking about our money, raising taxes, and making laws about religion.
Charles I really pushed this thing to the breaking point. He actually tried to rule for more than 10 years without even calling Parliament. Then he tried to force a new prayer book on the Scots, who were not having it. That sparked a rebellion, which meant he needed money for an army. And guess who he had to ask for that money? Yep, Parliament. The crisis was officially about to blow up.
And so this fight that had been simmering for decades,
This clash between a king who thought he was chosen by God and a parliament that demanded a say, it finally exploded. In 1642, England was plunged into a brutal civil war.
The whole country basically split right down the middle. On one side, you had the Cavaliers, they were the king's guys, and on the other side, you had the Roundheads, fighting for parliament. And their side was eventually led by this brilliant but also pretty ruthless general named Oliver Cromwell.
So after years of just savage, brutal fighting, Parliament's new professional army wins. And then they do something that was just unthinkable. They put their own king, Charles I, on trial for treason. And in January 1649, they executed him. Can you imagine? The shock waves from that were felt all across Europe.
And just like that, for the first and only time in its history, England was a republic. No king. But don't think for a second this was a democracy. It was pretty much a military dictatorship run by Oliver Cromwell. His rule was harsh, really harsh. And when he finally died, the whole republic thing just crumbled without him to hold it together.
So, that whole experiment with being a republic? Yeah, that was over. People were just tired of military rule, tired of the instability. They wanted a king again. And this leads to what we call the Restoration. But, and this is a huge but, things were going to be very different this time around.
So in 1660, Parliament invites the son of the king they executed, Charles II, to come back and take the throne. But this was not a return to the good old days for the monarchy. Charles II knew the score. He understood that he couldn't rule without Parliament's okay. That absolute power his dad fought and died for, gone. For good.
And this new era, this new partnership, it actually produced some amazing things, like landmark laws. The Habeas Corpus Act, I mean, this was a massive step forward for individual freedom. It basically says the government can't just lock you up and throw away the key without bringing you before a court. It's a cornerstone of the legal rights many of us take for granted today.
But there was one final showdown to come. The next king, James II, he was Catholic, and he seemed to have forgotten the lessons of the past. He tried to bring back that absolute, top-down rule. So the leaders in Parliament, terrified of a new Catholic dynasty, they took this huge gamble. They basically invited a foreign prince, William of Orange, to invade England and take the throne. And what's crazy is it worked. James II just fled without a fight. This bloodless takeover is what we called the Glorious Revolution, and it was the final nail in the coffin for absolute monarchy. From this moment on, it was clear, Parliament, not the king or queen, was the ultimate power in England. This created the foundation for the constitutional monarchy they still have today.
So think about where we started, a king's desperate search for a son, and where we ended up, a revolution that created a totally new kind of government. This whole 150-year struggle forged the radical idea that rulers have to answer to their people, and it left us with a legacy and a question that we are still debating all over the world today. What is the right balance between the power of the government and the rights of the people?